Thank you all for coming out. Come on in. Thank you all for coming out on a Friday evening. This is a dedicated crowd of intellectuals. Well done. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susanna Ural. I'm one of the co-directors of the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. If you have not done so already, please silence your phones, or you'll be that person. There's information about the Dale Center and some of our upcoming programs over on the table there on the side by the door. If you want to get any of our news, our newsletter, news about upcoming events, please just sign up there. And also, I want to make you aware of one upcoming event on Monday the 12th, Monday, November 12th. The Dale Center is teaming up with the City of Hattiesburg to commemorate Veterans Day. Our own Allison Abra, Andy Wiest, and Tommy Lofton, who's a graduate of our program and also the director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. All three of them will be kind of leading a panel discussion about the commemorations of the First World War on this 100th anniversary. All right, tonight's speaker. Lieutenant Colonel Joel R. Bius is an assistant professor of National Security Studies and the Director of Instruction in the Joint Warfighting Department at the Air Command and Staff College in Montgomery, Alabama. He has an MA in Military Studies with an emphasis in the American Civil War, well done, from the Air Command and Staff College, and he earned his PhD in U.S. History from the one and only University of Southern Mississippi. And we're very proud of him here in the Dale Center. Joel's military operational experience includes 10 years in strategic deterrence as an ICBM combat crew commander, instructor, and 20th Air Force Command evaluator. That's good.
Yeah, we got an elevator.
I'm like hearing flashbacks of Young Frankenstein. As well as operational counterinsurgency experience as Deputy J5 Police while serving with the U.S. Army in Kandahar, Afghanistan. In addition to teaching the Joint Warfighting and War Theory Core courses at ACSC, Colonel Bius also teaches electives on American military culture, the American Civil War, and the course I would like to take, the history of vice in military culture.
Yes.
Joel and his family arrived, I was trying to remember this, is it 2012 or 2013? 2012 in Hattiesburg to begin his PhD studies. And these were originally and rightly focused on the American Civil War. But he had 3 years, PhD students in the classroom, 3 years to complete all of his coursework and his dissertation. And as he and I will go back and forth on emails, and we'd occasionally talk on the phone about, have you found anything yet? Can we narrow this down somehow to a doable project? We were getting worried. And then Joel learned of a massive collection of documents that he could easily access, that were right for a project, and that could, with the right scholar, make a superb book. And so as sad as I was to see Joel leave a Civil War project, I could not be happier with the results of that decision. It led to the book that is hot off the press, and that, if we've timed this right, Barnes & Noble's going to be out there at the end of Joel's talk selling for Joel to sign, and it's also going to be the focus of his talk tonight.
That's right.
So, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Colonel Bius.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. It feels like I'm coming back home. Me and Lee, my wife, and we had a wonderful experience here in Hattiesburg and at Southern Miss. So thank you all for coming out. Dr. Bob Wieland is here in the back row, a former PhD student here as well. So coming into tonight. So welcome. We're both coming home, right, Bob? So anyways, I've given this talk a couple of times, and there's different crowds and different highlights. But one of the things I just want to highlight here tonight is how everything in this book that I'm going to talk to you about is really a product of my training and learning under these professors here, and it really is a product of my experience as a PhD student. And so with that, I'll start. Let me make sure I can click slides here. Good. So this picture, in a way, captures this topic and this book for me as I'm thinking about how to present it to you. But so this picture had been in my files for a while. It's one that I ran across while doing research at some point at the archives, and the provenance. It's there. Those of you in the archives, it's from Record Group 165, and it's from the Food Administration archives, and it says soldiers picking cotton. Okay. Now it's very interesting to me because this is in Camp Sheridan, Montgomery, Alabama, where I'm stationed. I live about 3 or 4 miles from where this photo was taken. And I thought, well, that's cool. One day I'm going to, frame that. And that'll be like an interest item. Say, hey, guys in Montgomery, Alabama. And I just put it away. Never thought about it anymore. And then as I kept looking at it, I said, I think there's more to this picture than meets the eye. And I started looking at it a little closer because it was advertised as just soldiers picking cotton. I'm like, okay, they're helping with the war effort by picking cotton. But as I started kind of zooming in with a magnifying glass and really studying it, you notice the proud commander right here in the middle of the screen there, proud of his soldiers. Turns out these are Ohio National Guardsmen getting ready for World War I, 1917, and they're in Montgomery going through training. And so they're citizen soldiers, so I'm like, well, that's cool. And then I look closer, and I'm like, wait a minute, if you start looking closer, you got a soldier here that's made a tie kind of out of cotton, and some guys are like wearing it on their hats, and I started to say, this is a staged photo. These are, because I've been downrange, and you take photos with the locals, like doing something that you do in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or whatever. And I said, these guys are just like me. There's more to this story. And so I started looking closer, and you see sectional themes, okay? This guy's eating watermelon, okay? And so these are Ohio Guardsmen. I'm picturing them as young guys. Their fathers and grandfathers served in the South in the Civil War, and they're telling them about the South. There was cotton and watermelon, and they're wanting to take a picture of their combat experience, and it involves, Montgomery, Alabama. So there's a sectional theme here. There's a racial theme here. A young black child eating watermelon. There's a much more to this story. It's a staged photograph, and that I'd walked by many times. And you're saying, okay, what does that have to do with cigarettes? Well, this smoke them if you got them is kind of a ubiquitous. Everybody's like, oh yeah, soldiers used to smoke, and then they just press on. And I started thinking, well, there's more to that story, just like there's more to this picture right here. And this is where it connects. There's one soldier not looking at the camera in this picture of many. So you always got the one. And it's a young, or I don't know, he's an NCO in the bottom of the picture down here. And he's, oh God, he's looking away, and he's got a cigarette in his mouth. And it's a rolled cigarette. It's not a manufactured cigarette from me looking at it with a magnifying glass. And the significance of that is there's only one soldier in this entire group that I can tell that has a cigarette, or if you would have taken this picture in 1950 of the same group of soldiers, statistics say about 70% of them would either be smoking or have a pack of cigarettes. They probably would have it in their mouth, because any of you, Vietnam photos, hey, we're taking a picture. Hold on a sec, let me get my cigarette in my mouth. So it's significant that in this photo that you have only one soldier smoking. And so, like, this photo, this picture, the smoke 'em if you got 'em, a slogan that's well known, we typically just walk by it, or we tell anecdotal stories about it. And the purpose of this book is to pause and consider the dramatic rise of smoking in the military, how it influenced a national cigarette smoking obsession, and then the dramatic fall in the fascinating political economy, all right, involved with both the rise and the fall. So I could camp out on this photo for a long time, and racial themes, sectional themes, but we'll move on because I have to move on so we can get to question and answer. So what I want to do now is tell you, kind of as I've done research here, about some of the most fascinating or surprising things that I found in writing this dissertation, which became a book. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk to you about is basically the status of manufactured cigarette smoking before World War I. So this first couple of things I'm going to talk to you about is a product of research I did in Dr. WWII's class on World War I historiography, and wrote a paper on that, which became pretty much a part of a couple of chapters in the book here. But one thing it was neat to discover was Americans didn't smoke manufactured cigarettes before World War I. If they smoked at all, it was generally pipes, tobacco, or chewing tobacco, or rolled cigarettes. There was only about 2 billion manufactured cigarettes smoked in the early 20th century a year, all right? And that number, as you're going to see, grows quite extensively. And the connection to masculinity. So smoking cigarettes, manufactured cigarettes, cigarette is the feminine version of cigar. So it was considered effeminate, or it was considered dandy, wimpy, or kind of associated with immigrant city dwellers. all looked kind of down upon. Men smoked tobacco in clubs or in with a smoking jacket on, and it was a negative connotation with smoking a cigarette at the time. There was not that masculine identity with cigarette smoking had not emerged yet. While taking an oral history class here, I listened to the oral history of Theodore Bilbo's son. And listening to that, I wasn't listening for smoking themes, but he tells a story about in the 20s going to a boarding school in Tennessee where, he just says in the oral history, hey, at this boarding school, you could have a pipe and you could have a cigar, but if they caught you with a cigarette, you were on the next train out of the place because it was considered, something that you just didn't do. You could be a 14-year-old boy smoking a pipe, but not a cigarette. And so that was interesting. A journalist in the period said, somehow or other, every good and decent manly American instinct protests against cigarettes. The man with a cigar or a pipe loses none of his manly attributes because of the cigar or pipe habit. Cigarettes were for, quote, dandies and sissies. That was the way things were thought of before World War I. So if you look at this picture, I've already told you about this one, but this is a photo. I mean, it's soldiers going on forever. That's a division, all right, preparing to, load up and get on a ship and go to World War I. These are the doughboys on the way. They got their rifles, their hats. Not many of them are going to have cigarettes in this picture. All right. Well, that's going to change as a result of World War I, which is one thing that I document in this story. So after 1920, responding to the increase in cigarette smoking, one observer concluded that World War I had changed the way Americans saw cigarettes. Quote, 10 or 15 years ago, cigarettes didn't have much of a standing in the community. All right, there was a neat distinction between the man who smoked cigarettes and the man who smoked cigars or pipes, or a pipe. That distinction seems to have disappeared today. So that's right in the wheelhouse of what we, did, war in society. That's a change in a wartime military that affects society. And it goes back and forth in this story. So direct product of my training here about how to think about things in military history. The next thing that I just found fascinating, which I'm going to, I could spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to have to, I got to drink a lot of water. It's allergy season over in Montgomery, so my voice has been struggling. But, and this is again a project I did with Dr. Weiss in his class. It's the central and ironic role of the YMCA played in driving the Army to issue a cigarette ration. So I didn't expect to find that. So as I began researching, I think it was for a paper, I was taking this class on, which I thought was a throwaway class, not a throwaway, but like, hey, I just got to get hours because like Dr. Yule said, I got to hurry, I got to take 4 classes at once, which is grad students back there like, you're crazy, and it was crazy. But there was a class on the history of tobacco in America, and Lee will tell you, I came home, like, I'm taking this tobacco class, it's just, I just got to get the hours, I never dreamed it, but I was taking a tobacco class and a World War I class, and I'm over in the library, and I said, man, I got to get familiar with this whole shelf of World War I books. And this one book stuck out called The Damn Y Man. And I'm like, why, what's so bad about the Y guys? I love the YMCA. I like the song. I like the guys that work there. What's wrong with the Y? So I sat down there in the library on the floor, and this little memoir from 1920 from a lady named Catherine Mayo, who was a Y worker, and she writes a book trying to defend the Y men. And I couldn't put it down reading about the Y men, but also the connection to cigarettes, which is, I'm going to tell you some about here. If you want to read the rest of it, hear the rest, you got to read the book. But this is a picture of Y men in training in Camp Sevier in South Carolina. And similar, I like the Kim Burns documentary, kind of zooming in on the pictures and what's going on here. Well, first of all, you've always got the 2 guys not looking at the camera, so same then as now. But second of all, if you look at this picture, notice in, say, the right here, you got a gentleman, he's kind of an old man, okay? Y man in training, they were in training learning how to run Y huts, how to do morale programs, do Bible studies, lead song groups, things like that. But you got an old guy, but look, this is a really young guy right here. And this guy looks like a steely-eyed killer right here to me. I mean, he's going to kill you, But he's a Y guy. So, I mean, I'm going to try to knit this together. You have this guy here, and notice he's got the YMCA lapel rank on, and they all have special uniform items. They're all wearing U.S. Army issued uniforms. Well, the Marines, when they initially started serving with the Army, they weren't allowed to wear their Marine lapel rank, which, you know, if anybody about Marines, that was a big deal. But the Y guys were allowed to wear their lapel distinctive rank. So it started to cause some angst, right? Notice that they're all wearing kind of the soldierly leggings here, the leather leggings. They look like a bunch of Texas A&M cadets, you know. They got the soldier look, they got the soldier hat. You know, but they look, some of them are old, you know, so they don't, but some of them look like healthy guys. Why aren't they conscripted? Why aren't they serving with the AEF and down in the trenches and carrying a rifle like we are? So how did they get involved with the cigarette ration? Well, it's interesting that as 12,500 of them volunteer to serve, they get uniforms, they get, you know, cool rank and leggings, and they go over. And Pershing, he subcontracts morale to the Y men. Basically, he says, listen, we got to fight a war. I got all I have on my hands with my officers to plan out traditional things like, you know, fire plans or logistics. I don't have morale. If I can give that to somebody else, I'll hand that away. So in comes the Y men. He handed it to the Y men, and they started running huts overseas. And he said, and I want this pushed forward as far as possible. So these guys are serving down in the trenches. So this picture here I found in the archives, and you can see in a trench, and this Y man here is giving a cigarette to a wounded soldier, and the caption that was captured in 1920 when they collected it said this had just been through an entire day of artillery barrage, and this white guy's down there handing out cigarettes and chocolate. And then you got this white guy over here, which actually is the same guy, but he's handing out cigarettes to a wiring party. Okay, these guys are setting up telegraph wires. And so soldiers began to have an insatiable demand for cigarettes. So I talk about it in the book, but they get connected with European soldiers that are smoking a lot of manufactured cigarettes, but also just the conditions, okay? The trenches, the smells, the incredible churning of the land and bodies and death and all that stuff that they were and the boredom, okay? I mean, there was intense boredom. They all equal smoking pressure, smoking cigarettes. And so they started wanting cigarettes. Where are they going to get their cigarettes from? Well, they don't have a ration. So your British guys have a rum ration, your French guys have other kinds of rations, including female companions and things like that. And the Americans are getting none of that, and they want cigarettes. And so that's a story that emerges. And when they come out of these trench lines, so there's a story about maybe this guy. He didn't give this guy a cigarette because he didn't have any money. Oh, that damn Y guy. This guy's got a bullet hole, but he ain't got money, so he doesn't have money, so he can't buy his cigarettes, and he denied him those cigarettes. And also, look at him. He should be serving like us. And then they would come out of the trenches and go to the rear, and you got all these Y huts, and they're like, hey, I want my carton of cigarettes. And they're like, okay, that'll be X amount of dollars. And so they started to get labeled as money grubbers and shirkers and guys that aren't doing their duty. And so it was just fascinating to drill that story all the way down from the library shelf here at the Cook Library all the way to the National Archives, driving that thing all the way into the ground. And I tell that story in the book of how it went from, thank you, Y guys, to, hey, we hate the Y guys, and led to General Payton March issuing a cigarette ration, which is the next story that I'm kind of going to talk about. But just the irony of all these guys who were recruited based on swearing that they didn't drink or smoke. A lot of them were pastors, and they write about in their diaries and stuff. Could you imagine my congregation now seeing me handing out cigarettes on Sunday to soldiers? One of the guys said, swearing seems to go with Army life. The American soldier soon became adept at the ancient art of cursing in uniform. He added that, quote, soon he found himself swearing in his dreams. He also wondered at the irony, like I said, of a pastor screen for all this, doing alcoholic beverages, selling cigarettes to cursing soldiers. So it's just a great, from taking Dr. Morgan's class about, Southern history and irony and all that, it's just I love irony. It's a very ironic story. This is a picture. Dr. Andy knows I'm a guitar picker, so I love this. I found the archives. The guy's playing his guitar, and he's got a cigarette in his mouth. This guy, Kevin Spacey right here, he's got a cigarette he's holding on to. And that's been interesting too, looking at these old pictures and finding how much they look like certain people. But I found in the archives were hospitals in the summer of 1918, after the cigarette ration was ordered, scrambling, trying to figure out how to get cigarettes to the soldiers that are convalescing. And like, how do we, there's no question about the health of it. It's just how do we get them, to these guys that are used to smoking. So that was interesting. So in the midst of all the complaining about cigarettes, access to a cigarette, why don't we have a ration, steps General Payton March. Now, I've heard of General Pershing, but I didn't know much about General Payton March. Well, here he is. This is General Payton March. This is General Pershing, and this is Newton Baker, the Secretary of War. This is General March, Payton March, getting an award after the war from Newton Baker, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But he steps into the trenches in February 1918, and he's been recalled. He's the Pershing's chief of artillery in Europe, and he's been recalled to be the chief staff of the Army. So any of you that studied in World War I know that it was a debacle in 1917 trying to get this huge expeditionary force overseas and trained and everything. And Newton Baker's like, I got to have a really good guy here to come in and fix this place. So March is the fix-it guy. So he does an inspection tour. And on that inspection tour in the trenches, apparently, and he writes about it here, nothing but complaining about cigarettes and the damn Y guys. So when he gets back to the War Department and he writes in his memoirs, which I found, they're published, but I also found the handwritten memoirs of the Library of Congress, where he wrote, I can't do this, but he wrote his entire manuscript, hand wrote the thing. And he writes about, one of the very first things I did was address soldiers' morale. So he talks about, and I remember like yesterday sitting in the Starbucks over there with General, he makes a guy a general of morale, Munson is his name, and I sat there reading like 600 pages of boring morale stuff. But that's what you have to do when you're a grad student, to find the little gems in there. But he made this guy a general. He said, I'm going to make this guy a general of morale. And then the next thing he says is he says, my soldiers associate morale with smoking cigarettes. And they don't like these guys that are subcontracted Y men, basically, serving as their morale. The Army should be in charge of their morale. And so he says, in his memoir, he says that he had become convinced in France that the use of tobacco by the troops needed to be regulated. Tobacco was obtainable to soldiers only by buying it. And many men were deprived of the use of the solace because they had no money. While other comrades were getting all the tobacco. Therefore, and this is, I directed that the order be issued making tobacco a part of the ration for issue to the soldiers. And he does this in March of 1918. So the only other book on this, even close to it, the author, the only other person that's written on this, connects it to congressional action in June. It's dated to General March ordering the cigarette ration, okay? So with that, off we go. 4 cigarettes a day becomes the standard. In 1918, you see people scrambling about how to do this, and then that's the rest of the story is history. The cigarette and the soldier become linked. They obtain about 5 billion total cigarettes during the war, and this is copiously documented in the archives, not because of the controversy of obtaining a cigarette ration, because the YMCA was so heavily investigated after World War I. Because if you study World War I, you know there was it's a businessman's war, it's a war for profit. Well, the YMCA comes under that specter. So they're called in front of Congress and all these investigating committees, and they have to document how many cigarettes they sold and how many they obtained. So it became a great source for me. And so we got to keep hopping and skipping. So World War I was just a fascinating, part of the story of entrenching the soldier in cigarette. It becomes a masculine thing to smoke cigarettes after World War I, and it wasn't before. But that's the bottom line. The other thing that was fascinating to me, of course, is all the cigarette ads from World War II. They make great posters, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of them. One of them happened to make it on the cover of the book the press chose. It's a Chesterfield ad, and it says, our fighting men rate the best. See that they get milder, cooler smoking Chesterfields. Everybody who smokes them likes them. And all of these are collected at Stanford University in their history of the impact of tobacco, cigarette advertising on America or something. They have them all collected there. It's incredibly interesting just to sit there and click through all the pictures. I love this one because I teach air power history. I'm at Air Command Staff College. My brother's a model airplane, nerd, so he'll tell you, hey, look, a green B-29. You don't really see those things. They were mainly silver. This is one for the that was for the China theater. We were initially started in China, but so you got a green B-29, but it says, hey, the cigarette that's winning the war. Help our boys toast Hitler, buy war bonds. Well, none of these planes flew over Europe. All right, so they weren't toasting Hitler, but you got to sell cigarettes, so ad sells. But what's fascinating to me, and I make this argument in the book, as I say, I'm quoting myself here, by World War II, the cigarette was not just a minor issue of supply and convenience, it was now a vital warfighting issue of strategic consequence. And so they're not kidding when they say, help us, the cigarette's the winning the war. And I approach this, like Dr. Ure was saying, I got my training, right? War and Society training. I'm sitting in here doing all the stuff you grad students are doing. But you also bring your own set of eyeballs of experience. And I've been downrange. And I know that if soldiers don't get, if it's a weight room, if it's a satellite phone, if it's hot chow, we don't issue cigarette rations anymore. That's in the book as well. But if you don't get those things, the war effort will grind to a halt. Okay? I mean, the Army fights on its stomach. Napoleon, if you do Civil War history, what's the first thing soldiers do when they arrive at a raging battle? They sit down and eat. And so this is all part of it. If by World War II, if you have a population that's smoking cigarettes at the level they are in World War II and continue, and that's what they're used to, and you don't get that to them, it becomes a problem. So much so, it gains the attention of the Truman Committee. So the Truman Committee was another thing I found absolutely fascinating. Side story here. The Truman Committee hearings, which happened in the December 1944. All right, it's a big thing when you print it off, and it's really tiny print. And I read the entire thing while watching the Conference USA baseball tournament, sitting out there. But I also have a son like Andy Wiest that was a baseball player, and he was working on his swing, and I was filming batters. So I'm reading this manuscript and then filming batters, and everybody thought I was a pro baseball scout. So I'm like, no, I'm not a pro baseball scout. I'm reading a 400-page congressional manuscript is what I'm doing. But side story there. But this was neat because if you look at the picture there, it's got a Time magazine photo of Senator Truman, and it's got a spotlight shining down on the Capitol and industry. So it's the idea that we're going to make sure we don't have war graft. World War I, there was the accusation there was graft. World War II, we're going to fight this from the very beginning. So the Truman Committee was in operation from 41 all the way through 48. Well, one of the things in 1944, there's this complaint about a cigarette shortage in America. Civilians are complaining about access to cigarettes. They're writing their senators and congressmen. The congressmen meet to discuss this over several months. And the gems in there that come out, the highlights from the rations, are really the part of the World War II chapter that I spend the most on because it's that good political economy. But first of all, the Army's planning assumption was that every soldier in uniform smoked. So there was one part of the trial where a colonel, Fred Foy, I was like, wow, a colonel and his job title is cigarette procurement. I'm like, that's pretty epic. I want that on my business card. But he's the cigarette procurement guy for the Army, and he's sitting there, and they're like, give the testimony. And he starts reading. Okay, we've got this, we got that. And a congressman interrupted and said, wait, hold on. Do you just assume that every soldier in the United States military smokes? And he goes, yes. And then they press on, and it affects the way he calculates the amount of cigarettes that he needs to get. So I thought that was pretty cool from my study in World War I where no one smoked to by World War II. The assumption for planning is that every soldier smokes. One cigarette industry rep testified that there's they could view no ceiling of the cigarette demand inside, that it's just exponential. He says, the production and consumption of cigarettes has leaped to astronomical heights in recent years, yet the saturation point is not yet in sight. As a matter of fact, no one is capable of forecasting when a point of saturation will be reached. It is rather silly to even contemplate a limit on cigarette consumption. Well, that was neat. RGR chairman testified that soldiers were their greatest customers. And he says they were even better smokers, after the start of the war. He says, according to our observation, soldiers were good smokers, but they became very better much smokers when they went in the Army. And the folks left at home became better smokers when the war broke out. So I have a section in the book where I call this norms and nerves. You know, this is the World War II generation, the greatest generation of smokers as well, because it's a very difficult time they went through. So they smoked cigarettes. The song, smoke, smoke, smoke them cigarettes. Here we go. The Army and the committee's main focus emerged was to make sure that the soldiers were getting all the rations they needed. So it says in here, the Army says, quote, "We're committed to buying whatever the demand is in theater." The senators on the panel echoed this commitment. They said, if the theater commanders, if the boys are getting all the cigarettes that they require, then we're off to a good start. But we want to make sure that they're getting the cigarettes first and a sufficient supply to meet demands. So I thought, you know, that was interesting. They were very much committed at both ends to making sure soldiers got the mountain of cigarettes that they were issued, which talks to this. The World War II ration was about 12 to 28 manufactured cigarettes per day. That's what I calculate. I have a big fat footnote that explains how I arrive at that math. Never was great at math, but I think I got this right. American males only smoked about 5 a day before World War II. So what this was your ration pack had each had 4 cigarettes in it, and you got 3 of them a day, and so that's 12. But they were taking the packs that were sent over for soldiers to buy, which is 16 cigarettes, and it's the document, the Army says, the colonel says, but commanders are just putting those in ration packs. So they're getting 28 a day possibly, and that wasn't even enough. You know, so they're smoking a lot of cigarettes in World War II. The Army was the lead agency for procurement, and I calculate they procured 350 billion cigarettes during World War II for soldiers' consumption. And I thought it was interesting, they also supplied 50 million condoms a month during World War II, which is incredible. Found out that in that's my vice class, whoever, Dr. Ural, you can tell me about that. Cigarette procurement effort touched on lingering issues from the New Deal. American political economy and party politics were alive and well in the midst of war. So this is war in society at its best. So this is, you know, this is Dr. Kirakutis preparing for his exams because he's a New Deal guy. And this is Dr. Bo Morgan taking his Southern history class. Made me realize as I'm studying this topic that this 1944 hearing, there's contentious debate going on about government control of production, of consumption, of land use. I'm like, this is left over from, the New Deal is still very new to these people as they go into the World War II. And so you have Republican congressmen that are hounding the testifiers saying, why can't you just make billions of more cigarettes? And they're saying, well, because of land use restrictions and because of, you know, the tobacco crop has a growth rate on acreage based on New Deal policy. And so that debate, you know, between, hey, we're in the midst of war, but there's still lingering political issues that they're trying to bring up during this debate. So I talk about that, but that was an interesting outgrowth of deep study for, you know, again, here at the Dell Center that I would have just brushed over. And it's actually now part of another book that I was telling Dr. Haley about that on the environmental history of World War II. So I took that little snippet in the book and turned it into a much bigger project now that's going to be a part of a new book at some point. So one day. And let's see, this is fascinating too. The cigarette industry saw the cigarette ration as a vital aspect of post-World War II economic recovery in Europe and saw soldiers as their main, quote, cigarette missionaries. So that's a direct quote from the hearings where one of the industry said, quote, American leaf tobacco and cigarettes will enjoy a larger and more active demand among foreign nations after the war than in any other time in history. The men in the armed forces, striding audaciously across the global map with their omnipresent cigarette, are doing a super job of selling the rest of the world on American tobacco. Now, break. The rest of the world was smoking, right? Europeans were smoking cigarettes, but they weren't smoking American cigarettes. Not after World War II. Lend-Lease exports of leaf tobacco likewise contributed toward a buildup of a vastly expanded post-war market. And he says, all this missionary work will go for naught if the production of leaf tobacco is not stepped up sufficiently to allow for a large exportable surplus after the war. It takes 3 years to cure tobacco to make a cigarette, so you got to plan in advance. So he's saying, hey, we got to keep this ball rolling. Well, and this is another scholar has picked up on this topic, and I don't know if she looked at my manuscript, but she's writing a book that covers 45 to 73, the period that I don't cover. And she's got a paper out on it that I read, and she says the Marshall Plan included $1 billion in American cigarette aid, representing a third of all money earmarked for food and 7.7% of the entire plan package. Which is, every time I read, everybody's like, that's incredible. Well, that's transitions to the next part of the book, which is the growing power of political economy. There's a cigarette lobby that's growing, and she's going to write about this in this book, about how they got so much of the Marshall Plan dedicated to cigarettes. It's a windfall for the industry, America, Europeans, all the way around. I love this picture I found in the archives of Marine. I mean, you can just look at it and see the dirt and the grime and the sweat, the beard. That's a good probably week 2 growth, and he's blowing the cigarette smoke out of his nose. And it's on, I think it's Paleoloo. And you can imagine why soldiers wanted cigarette in World War II just looking at that picture there. Little cultural history here. If you watch the show Mad Men, this is the first episode way back whenever Don Draper is sitting in the bar and he's asking this gentleman who's this waiter who's smoking Old Golds. And he says, "Why do you smoke Old Golds?" And he says, "Well, it's what they gave me in the service." So this is a picture I found in the archives of at the end of the war, during the demobilization phase of World War II. They had huge demob camps in Le Havre, France, 4 of them. And they're all named after cigarette brands. So the picture here says, Camp Lucky Strike, the tent city where the men outnumber the women 100,000 to 1. So the soldiers entered the war smoking. They left the war. When they left these camps, they were given, tons of cartons of cigarettes and stuff. And they came back to America. And that transitions us, to the next part of the story, basically. But by the 1950, 80% of men are using tobacco. The vast majority of that tobacco intake is coming from cigarette smoking. So in a 50-year period, you have this great transition in American history. So then there's a few little, how am I doing on time, Lee? Or anybody? What time is it? I don't have my watch up here.
6:38.
6:30. Okay. So key events in the middle. You have 1950, I've already talked about that. Cigarette smoking is proven deadly. Cigarette industry organizes in 54, and they come out with the frank statement saying, hey, we've got it covered, don't worry about it. 64, Surgeon General's report. 66, the first warning labels. But I picked the story back up in 1973. So the rise and now the fall of the cigarette ration. And this is John Travolta. It's his first commercial as a young actor. And so what does that have to do with cigarettes? Well, it was fascinating to look at the start of the all-volunteer force and the end of the cigarette ration literally happened in the same month, in June 1973. So tracing that connection out was an important part of this project. So this is a commercial for the all-volunteer force, so we're not drafting anymore. Hey, come join the Army. You can tour Europe and have a good time. Well, at the same time, Representative Charles Bennett, I never heard of him until this story. He was a World War II veteran, got polio, serving in Papua New Guinea, so he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Won his election from Jacksonville, Democrat, 1949, a fiscal conservative, and he won 21 straight elections until he retired in the 90s. Just a fascinating guy. I discovered his archive at Florida, and in there was a sealed envelope that said tobacco ration. I'm like, ooh, this is big. And he was the guy that introduced legislation in 1973, June. Well, it was actually before that, but it was passed in June 1973, to get rid of the cigarette ration. And what was fascinating was his instinct was fiscal first and physical second. So fiscal. He thought it was the taxpayers should not be responsible for paying for cigarettes. Number one. And he calculates all these figures about how much it costs and stuff. So he's a fiscal conservative. Number two, he's familiar with the all-volunteer force and the arguments for and against. And he says, the argument here is you're going to get young John Travolta and you're really going to keep him for a career. Healthcare costs are going up. If you have your majority of your force, which at this time, they're in the 70s, 80s, 50 to 60% are chain smokers, if you keep them around for 20 or 30 years after chain smoking, the healthcare costs are going to be, incredible. So he was like on the forefront of that. And so he introduced legislation. He didn't get a big fight, and cigarette rations ended quietly in June of 1973. But that didn't end the story there, all right? So as the industry realizes that in the 70s they're having a big fight here about the cigarette, about how to keep starters, and now we have 20 years of knowledge about the dangers of cigarette smoking. It initiates this in a very big fight about involving the interaction between big tobacco, big business, and big time politics, and then how it spilled over into the DOD. So as I'm looking, this is in Dr. Down in the coast, post-World War II class, Bristol, his class. This is the research I did for that class. The AVF. And the big business gets involved. When do you start smoking? Is it when you're 32, 25? No, it's 14 to 18, and legally 18. Okay, what are you doing when you're 18? You're making decisions about what to do in life. You're joining the military. Well, the draft has ended. The ration has ended. The industry is very nervous about where are we going to get our starters from. And so it initiates this great political struggle between, for example, Horace Cornegay here, which is the president of the Tobacco Institute, and they, in military terms, they initiate a huge denial campaign. Cigarettes don't cause lung cancer, it's air conditioning units and light bulbs and things like that. And then you have big business gets involved. So I'm like, where's this going? How did I got on Lee Iacocca with his cigar in his hand. Well, he takes over Chrysler Corporation in 1978, that's just failing. And he realizes one of the reasons why they're failing is their incredible healthcare cost. He calculates that they're spending $1 million a day on healthcare. He says, what am I going to do about it? Well, his old friend Joe Califano, who was no friend to the cigarette industry, has been fired by President Carter. Bob Whelan gets into a lot of Carter and Weinberger stuff in his dissertation here, which I used a lot of his dissertation for this work. And he is fired because Carter's base is nervous about the Secretary of Health and Welfare, Health, Education, and Welfare, who's anti-smoking. Carter comes from tobacco country. He was put in office by a lot of tobacco interests. And this guy's talking about trying to make America stop smoking. So Carter relieves him. He takes him out of office. I talk about it in the book. And Iacocca picks him up and says, I want you to be on my board, and I want you to solve this healthcare problem for me. And what does Iacocca do? What does Califano do? He initiates the great smoke out campaign at Chrysler. So Califano in his research determines that smokers cost you 75% more than non-smokers in terms of your health care. The numbers are just insane. And so Chrysler initiates the big smoke out campaign, and then the DOD picks up on the same theme. So society bleeds over to war. So next you got the downfall of the cigarette in the 1980s, which I talk about in the book, but I'll talk about it briefly here, with this connection between Jesse Helms, all right, and Caspar Weinberger. Kathy Weinberger. So Jesse Helms he's an interesting guy. He's not elected to Congress as a senator until 72 or 73, and he's like a radio show host. Rush Limbaugh, kind of a very conservative, firebrand, and this government telling you can't smoke, and he gets elected to Senate. And the senators, usually their first year, they're just quiet. Second year, maybe they're on some subcommittee. No, his first and second year, he's a firebrand. At the time, Weinberger is the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and Weinberger has a pedigree of anti-smoking going all the way back to California. So he's talking all this about warning labels. He was at the FCC. He initiated the warning labels. Now he's pushing anti-smoking. In 1975, he publishes an anti-smoking report, and Helms is new to Congress, and he fires him up by saying, financed by taxpayer, Weinberger's done it again. Exposing the rest of the world to his annual tizzy over cigarette smoking. So he's nervous about Weinberger. Weinberger goes away, and Helms thinks, well, I don't have to worry about this guy anymore. Well, Reagan wins in a landslide, 1980. Who does he nominate for his Secretary of Defense? Caspar Weinberger. Confirmation hearing. We've watched the contentious confirmation hearing on television. It's not supposed to be that contentious. It's supposed to be a slam dunk. You win in a huge election. You say, I want this guy, they ask him a few questions, and everybody votes. And it's pretty much, it was a slam dunk, except for 2 votes. Guess who voted against Caspar Weinberger? 2 gentlemen from the party that won the election, 2 staunch Republicans from North Carolina. Caspar Weinberger and his fellow Bob East, right? Is that his name? They vote against, and they say, and this is ironic, they say it's because they think he's going to be weak on defense, right? Cappy, the ladle, that he's going to be weak. Well, it turns out that's one of the most, misguided interpretations. No, it's because they know he's going to initiate smoking cessation in the Department of Defense, which I document. That's exactly what he does. By 1986, he institutes DOD 1010.10 on 11 March 1986, which is generally initiates smoking cessation as policy, official policy in the military, saying, it's kind of watered down. It says, hey, we want to encourage soldiers to stop smoking. It's not, consistent. Well, the Army comes out a month later, and their U.S. Army tobacco cessation plan is hardcore. It says soldiering and smoking is not compatible. It restricts where you can smoke, and it also includes provisions that throw you in the brig if you don't follow these regulations. And so that initiates the end of the story. But the whole thing, I like this quote from Caspar Weinberger here, the political economy that I engage in really in the second half of the book. He says, look, the tobacco issue has presented the government with a paradoxical situation attempting to balance the negative health impacts against the positive economic impacts of smoking. Smoking made tons of money for corporations, for investors. Congressmen were supported by the Tobacco Institute. I mean, there's a whole John Grisham novel buried, within the story here. How deep does the money go kind of thing. I'm waiting for slow black cars driving in front of the house and stuff like that. But it's just fascinating the way it went after that. A couple little anecdotal things here, then I'll open it up for question and answer. What's the smoking rate today? Well, it's slowly attrited down. By the 90s, it's about the same in the military as it is in. So they wanted to be the same. So part of the problem was, let me back up real quick. It's not just the ration; it's the subsidies. You could buy cigarettes on base for half price. When I came in '96, you could go get a carton for half price, all the way up till 2002. You could get tons, so you go and you have all these retirees buying their cigarettes once a month for half price. Well, those subsidies end, so you get to the point where the smoking rate in the military is about what it is in civilian. Right now, I just looked the statistics up, 15.5% of Americans smoke cigarettes, about 20.9% or 24% of military. But to show you how much the culture has changed, you can't smoke in uniform if you're an officer, where I teach at Air Command and Staff College. So I do not know a single colleague that smokes cigarettes. I call it the lonely cigarette butt can that speaks many languages. Out in front of it's right out front of my office. I see it all the time, and I think about how this whole thing unfolded. But it's out there, and there's nothing but foreign officers out there. They smoke like crazy. But first of all, you can't smoke if you're in the military. But other things, like last week, they sent us the thing we have to fill out before our physical fitness exam, and I was chuckling to myself because right in the middle of the page here it says, do one or more of the following risk factors apply to you? Smoke tobacco product in the last 30 days. If yes, stop. You can't take your physical fitness test. So that's the story. 1900, nobody smoked cigarettes in America. After World War I, a lot of people are smoking. World War II, 350 billion cigarettes, 80% of American males are smoking. And then the downfall to today, where it would be hard for you to find in garrison. Now I'm talking downrange, guys start smoking again. But in the continental United States, you're not going to find near the level of soldiers smoking cigarettes. That's the story. I'm sticking to it. Buy the book, and you can read more about it. So let me answer any questions that you may have. Bob, I know you got a question, so you got to hold up. Yes, sir.
Joe, if I could ask a kind of process question.
Okay.
Just from this presentation, it's clear, and kind of for all graduate students, but it's clear that dissertation has undergone some, you built on the dissertation.
Right.
Could you talk about the process of turning the dissertation into a book?
I talked to the grad students today, and I kind of discussed this with them a little bit, but one of the things I had to do was incredibly sharpen my focus. So if you look at the front of I was glad to see it upstairs, because you spend all that money to print it off, the dissertation upstairs. It's there, but it says The Soldier and the Cigarette, 1918 to 1986. Well, that focus made it appear it was going to be this all-inclusive study every year. And so I realized in the publishing process, I had to narrow the title to Smoking Gun, The Rise and the Fall. And I had to make it very clear that I was focusing on the Army and the years and why I skipped the middle and how it was a story of a political economy. So you have people that'll pick it up thinking they're going to read a good soldier story where it's nothing but stories. Man, I smoked 1,000 cigarettes while I was flying planes. That stuff's in there. It's in the footnotes, though. So the biggest thing was, I had to go from 130-some thousand words down to 100,000, but I didn't lose any of the meat. You guys read it it's just getting incredibly focused in your writing. And the introduction went from like 22 pages down to like 4. And just very laser-like focus. And anything that wasn't focused on that, I had to ditch. I'm a storyteller, so there's big stories in there that I'm just like, I got to let go of it. I can't have that story in there. It's making it too long. So that's the biggest thing, is just revising. Now, one thing I will add is I didn't want to have to get into policy and government documents, but my chair is like, you got to have a chapter. So while I was here, I added a chapter that I didn't plan on doing on healthcare policy, because you can't tell that story because it's a healthcare story. So I had to get into all, do a lot, and it turned out to be a fascinating chapter. I thought it was going to be boring, but, listen to your advisor, and he says, look, this is good, but you're going to have to add a chapter. You got to do some more research. So that became another chapter in the book. Yes, Dr. Abra.
Thanks, Bill. That was really interesting. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the comment that you made right at the beginning about sort of the views of cigarette smoking before World War I as being effeminate, and kind of what the gender implications of this were throughout. So when you have the advertising in World War II with the manly soldier and fighting Hitler and so forth being linked to cigarettes, do you think that obviously, I think probably the sort of negative implications potentially disappeared, but do you think that this becomes a way that they're constructing masculinity kind of through?
Absolutely.
And does that have an impact on why the broader public? Like, are they choosing to smoke because it's what the soldiers are doing? And
well, I link it to, like you're saying, literally before World War I, if you saw a 23-year-old guy maybe walking around smoking a cigarette, you thought either bad things or a dandy or effeminate, which was surprising. But now after World War I, if you're standing in that train shed and you see this grizzled soldier walking off with a pack of cigarettes and he's smoking, the story literally changed. It was Jared Rudy writes a book called Smoking and something. It's not on my topic, but he writes about that if you before, to be masculine, you had to go out and like kill an animal or go be Teddy Roosevelt. After World War I, you just had to smoke a cigarette. So yeah, it absolutely. Now, women smoking, it didn't. That's another fascinating aspect of the book that's kind of I wasn't able to do a lot on. It was in the footnotes, but the War Propaganda Administration, right, to get America to go to war. America didn't want to go to war in World War I, so they had propaganda. These guys got America behind the war, and then they let them go. Well, they established the marketing in New York, Edward Bernays, and one of the first things they do is use those techniques to sell women on smoking in the 1920s, is to how to change that imagery and stuff. So I think there was at first just general, I'm a young boy, I see a soldier smoking a cigarette, I want to smoke a cigarette, and it goes from there. So it's like in the 90s when the industry was saying, hey, we got anti-smoking cigarette ads, and it's a guy in sunglasses and a leather jacket smoking a cigarette, and the girls are hanging off of him, and it says, don't be that guy, don't smoke cigarettes. Of course, all the kids are like, well, I want to smoke cigarettes. And so, yeah, it was interesting, just the masculinity and the connection to, a lot of the study I did here in class, and but I hope I answered your question.
Yeah,
I don't know. Dr. Ural?
Do you have time to talk a little bit about how you did come to the project?
So it's interesting just standing here, because the class I was in, Dr. Kirakuta's class, I think was the next one over, And I was like you guys, a grad student, taking 4 classes at once. I had Dr. Wee's class, and I had 2 other ones, and then I had this elective on tobacco, history of tobacco industry. I think he only taught it here 1 time. I don't know. But in that class, it's an over and under class, and I'm in there with undergraduates, and they're like, and I'm like, I know I'm gonna have to do a research project, but I'm gonna hide and not talk about it. So maybe he won't ask me about it, and I can just get by taking blue book tests and things like that, because I'm swamped. And first class, he didn't say anything. Second class, he didn't say anything. Third class, and I'm starting to get interested. I'm like, I think, man, this is incredible, the amount of stuff that we have. And we're walking to the restroom down here, and we're washing our hands, and he's standing next to me in there, and he says, by the way, Joel, what are you going to do your research on? And I'm like, oh, crap. And I said, well, I thought about just doing something on smoking policy in the Air Force, because I just came from an assignment where the last thing I had to do was deal with foreign officers who were told they couldn't smoke cigarettes. And I gave that to the guy that replaced me, thinking I would never look at this ever again. So there I am standing in the restroom right there, and I'm saying, I'll just write this paper, and then that's how it started. So I remember I printed off a bunch of stuff. I found this archive. There's 60, 70 billion scanned documents. And and it's searchable, and I printed off stuff about that thick, and we're making a road trip across the panhandle of Florida, and I'm reading this testimony from Congress in the 70s where Jesse Helms is saying all this bombastic stuff. And I said, Lee, I think this is it. I think I'm going to go tell Dr. Ural that I'm not doing Civil War anymore. That conversation I had in the bathroom this is pretty serious now. So I talked to Dr. Haley and said, I think there's a story here, and away it went. So. And it's a book now. So started in a bathroom at Southern Miss, literally.
Joel, speaking of that, the wet-dry thing with alcohol and the way that can divide cultures, and that's a whole world out there too. How about with the tobacco? Let's say, I don't know, a Saudi officer enjoys a pack of cigarettes up at Maxwell, and the fellow from Utah, say, doesn't, or does this create a division?
Division how? Did the foreign guys can smoke and
or the problem?
No, it's very strange. I wanted to take a picture, but some of them you're not allowed to take pictures of. But there's 20 of them out there every 50 minutes. 20 to 30 of them smoking up a storm, and American officers, you just don't even think anything about it, I notice a lot of Army guys are dipping now, all right, because you can get away with that in the building, but you just, I don't think it creates a divide, the only thing that created a divide was when an American female civilian went outside and told a Saudi royal prince that he could not smoke a cigarette within 5 feet of the building. And that caused a huge incident, and we had to get to the bottom of that, and diplomatic issues and stuff like that. But if you don't know, I mean, the industry here is in a maintenance phase. They're not really growing here in America. It's overseas. It's just exploding. If you go to Indonesia or Malaysia, it looks like the 1930s in America. There's giant billboards everywhere, puffing cigarettes. Doctor, what kind of cigarette do you smoke? And stuff like that. So. Time for one more? We finished? Okay. Well, thank you for coming out to hear me talk about the book.